Let's just thank the choir and Don and Ariel one more time this morning for this beautiful music. Unbelievable. I think I've told you that a pastor once told me it is hard to cook on a cold stove, and certainly the stove has been stoked and is warm this morning. So as we get closer to wrapping up this series this month with Laugh, we've come to that time of growing in our relationship with Christ, and really you begin to see how all of these are so interconnected. Once we get to this point, you begin to realize that part of our growing relationship with Christ is really that we have to have learned to have loved and to accept God's plan for our life, and we have to unite with one another. That really part of growing is in a communal setting in our Christian faith. We've all heard that person that would say, I don't have to go to church to be a Christian. Anybody ever heard anybody say that? I'm not going to ask you if you ever said it. You're here. I'm assuming maybe you haven't. But maybe some of us at some point in our lives have felt the very same way. Because sometimes church is the very last place that we might find Jesus, depending on the Sunday morning. But one who would say, I don't have to go to church to be a Christian, I guess I can go along with that. But I don't know why one would want to be a Christian and not be in relationship and community with other Christians. For I don't think we can truly grow in our relationship with Christ unless we are growing in relationship with others. Now, the disciples are just a funny bunch of people. They're a unique cast of characters. I think if we could take out, we're talking about laugh, and then I preached a sermon on laughter. The disciples give us some of our funniest moments in the Gospels. They're just kind of a ragtag bunch that Jesus has gathered together. Now, we think of them as a ragtag bunch. The fact of the matter is, each of them had a very specific purpose, and Jesus chose them for a very specific reason. To an outsider looking in, though, they look like a hodgepodge. Tax collectors and zealots and all kind of fishermen and all sorts of folks gathered together to follow Jesus around. They were disciples. From the disciples, we glean the word discipleship. And discipleship is all about growing in our relationship with Christ. What are the ways that we disciple one another in the faith? How do we grow? How do we get stronger? How do we become the people that God has created us to be? I start with one place, and it's a text we've used already this series, but I think it's critical to our understanding. I've said that Jesus knew that some of us couldn't remember 10 things, so he figured he'd give us 2. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the other law and the prophets. This morning, we're reading that from Matthew's Gospel, the 22nd chapter, beginning in the 34th verse. We found versions of that elsewhere in the Gospels. But Jesus once again challenged on what it means to be a Christian. He says you got to love God and you got to love each other. And you got to love yourself and take care of yourself. We've got to be the people God created us to be. Talking to the children this morning, and they caught on very quickly. How is it that we get to know one another? How is it that we get to know someone that we don't yet know? Well, you got to talk to them. And it's the kind of talking not just that we exchange in passing, as we talked about a few weeks ago, the how are you, not really wanting to know how somebody's doing. The way that you get to know someone through communication and relationship requires a deeper level of commitment and understanding. It requires a willingness to ask those questions about who they are and what makes them tick. But how many of us think about having conversations with God like that? How many of us ask God questions? I suspect a lot of us tell God a lot. I've shared my mind a time or two with God. There's some things along the way that I haven't understood and quite frankly didn't really like. And when those times have come along, I've shared those thoughts with God. I've been in more than one situation in which I was being tested on a subject where I begged God for somehow, some way, those answers to come to me as I sat there trying to remember. But how many times have I just sat and listened? Or how many times have I asked God, God, what is it you need from me? How is it that I can help? What is it that I can do to make a difference? The disciples were the same way. They were constantly wanting to explain to Jesus how he should do ministry. You remember all along the way, Peter was the worst. Peter was constantly going to tell Jesus how things should be done. James and John were just figuring out who was going to sit on the right hand and who was going to sit at the left hand. And their mom was getting in the middle of it just to make sure it all got taken care of just right. But the disciples were constantly trying to tell Jesus what to do, and when Jesus would ask them to go out and do something for him, they would often return just complaining and fussing that the work was too hard or too difficult, or that they weren't capable of doing what it was that Jesus had sent them to do. They had 3 years to spend with Jesus. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine today having 3 years to spend with Christ? To walk alongside him, to eat meals with him, to laugh with him, to pray with him, to hear him preach. Yet through all of that, they just didn't get it. One of my favorite illustrations, one of my favorite metaphors for church are the giant sequoia trees, the redwoods. How many of you have ever seen the redwoods in California? Anybody? I have not. I want to desperately. I particularly want to after having heard the redwood tree described as a metaphor for the church. If you know anything about redwoods, you know how unique a species of tree they are, how tall they grow. What you may or may not be aware of is what makes them or allows them to survive and thrive and to grow so tall. One would think that a tree that tall would have to have very deep roots. The fact of the matter is that most sequoias, most redwoods' roots don't go any deeper than 3 feet below the ground. But they extend several hundred feet in every direction. One sequoia tree's roots can take up over several acres in a redwood forest. Now think about this as well. When you've seen a picture of the redwoods, or if you've been to visit the redwood forest, are they spread out acres apart? If you look at them, they're always in a grove, and they grow close together. And if their roots are spreading out hundreds of feet in every direction, the way that sequoias grow so tall and so strong is all of their roots are interconnected. The way that they grow tall and strong is that they grow together. They interconnect with one another. Those trees on the outside take the brunt of the wind. Through time, as they grow together, their bark thickens and becomes tougher and tougher and tougher, able to resist forest fires. Their chemical composition and their very bark is made up of chemicals that are resistant to disease and to rot. And all those things together allow the redwoods to grow tall and strong. Now, when I started thinking about this as a metaphor for the church, I tend to overthink things a little bit. There's some people in the church this morning that know how I tend to overthink things a little bit. I can become a bit obsessive about things. And so I try to make this metaphor work in my mind, and I'm worried because I know that in my heart, Christians should have deep roots. But the metaphor held up because as I thought about it, our roots are not in this world, but we're reaching toward heaven to establish roots there. So our goal is not to dig so deep into the earth that we can't loose its bounds, but the goal is to grow together strong with one another to reach toward God, to become the people that God has created us to be. If we take that metaphor a little further, if we're going to grow together, we have to unify and unite with one another. We have to be of a common purpose and a common cause. As our roots grow together, we can't be fighting for the same resources, but we need to make the use of the resources that we have in common. As our roots grow together, we might be stepping on one another's toes from time to time. And when that happens, we have to understand that that too has a way of holding us together. Our chemical composition that allows us to resist rot and disease is by praying with one another, learning together the Scriptures, learning what it is that Christ taught us, communicating with one another. One of my favorite things to do is to officiate weddings and to meet with the couple before that time and to get to know them and to understand who they are and as much you can in a short period of time. And one of the things that I talk about is that communication is a thread that runs through all of the challenges that we have in marriage. As we think about growing in our relationship with Christ, I think one of the relationships on earth that may closely resemble that is our married relationship. The amount of time we spend with one another, the amount of communication that is required to make that relationship work and grow. The fact that there are days that challenge that relationship and the ways that we have to work to overcome those challenges. Our communication with God is so critical. Yet I would venture to say for most of us, the time we spend in prayer is so small that it doesn't give us the opportunity to hear God's voice and to direct us in the ways He would have us to go. To grow in relationship with Christ or each other, we've got to communicate. We've got to be open. We've got to be willing to share. If we're going to be in relationship with one another, we've got to communicate. We also have to spend time together. If we're going to grow in relationship, we have to be willing to do the hard work. The ways that we spend time with God, as I've said to the children this morning, or we come to worship, that may be one of the most important places that we have an opportunity to grow. Because before we gather in here on Sunday mornings, some of us have gathered around the building for Sunday school. Many more of us gather in our space behind me and out in the narthex as we come in. For many of us, we haven't seen each other all week. We want to catch up and know what's happened in the week in between. We want to know how each other are doing. We come into this place and we spend time with one another. Another way that we spend time with God is through study. In the coming months, we're going to continue to ramp back up with our small groups, and we're going to find new ways to be in intentional study with one another through Bible study and topical studies, in any way that we can join in the same space to learn more about God, because as we do, we will grow in our relationship with God.